The wind howled through the skeletal remains of what was once New Atlanta, now little more than a husk, wrapped in alien steel and shadow. Mara Quinn crept through the derelict corridors of the underground detention complex beneath District 7, her breath shallow, every step a gamble against the biomech enforcers patrolling above. The mission was supposed to be simple: find the server core, extract old tactical archives from the first wave of the resistance. Data long thought purged by the alien governors. But as she bypassed a corrupted security door and stepped into Cell Block C, her pulse stumbled. Cell 9 wasn't on the schematics. It was sealed in obsidian plating, cold to the touch, humming faintly with residual energy. She bypassed the lock and slipped inside, and what she saw made her blood chill. There, slumped in the far corner, was a man barely more than bone and rags, his face hidden behind a tangled beard, skin waxy, eyes nearly blind from darkness. He didn't speak, didn't move, just existed. But there was something wrong about how he existed, like the room itself was holding its breath for him. The air felt denser, the silence heavier. She scanned his prison, and her hands began to shake as the biometric tags came online. Reed Lawson, the Iron Ghost, Earth's youngest military commander, vanished 38 years ago after leading the last major resistance strike. Officially Kia, but here he was alive, starved but unbroken, tortured but whole in the places that mattered. The rumors had become whispers, the whispers became myths, and the myths were forgotten, but this man was real. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You're supposed to be dead." He didn't respond, just stared through her, as if his mind was in some place darker than this prison could ever be. She tried again. "They broke everyone else. You're all that's left." That's when he finally moved. His lips parted. A dry voice rasped out, like a blade pulled across old bone. "Then they didn't look hard enough." And in that moment, Mara knew this wasn't just a relic. This wasn't just a survivor. This was Earth's last weapon, buried alive and forgotten by history, waiting. As she slipped her data drive into the wall and uploaded the scrambled signal back to Resistance Command, her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of hope being reborn. Her message was just 3 words. "We found Lawson before the skies darkened with Varanth warships, before cities were erased from the map by beams of impossible energy, before humanity was reduced to pockets of resistance scattered across a dying Earth." Reed Lawson had been something more than just a soldier. He was a symbol. In his early 20s, he commanded Earth's last united defense from a crumbling stronghold in the Texan Badlands, rallying a fractured species with nothing but raw conviction and strategic brilliance against a force that saw humans as resources, not rivals. He had stood tall when the sky rained fire, when whole battalions were atomized in plasma storms, when former allies folded and pledged loyalty to the invaders for the promise of safety or survival. At the Battle of Dakar, his unit had made its final stand. Outgunned and outnumbered, surrounded on all sides by Varanth mechs and their human enforcers. The world assumed he died there, his name etched into whispered legends, a ghost story told by the few who remembered when humans still had commanders instead of cowards. But he didn't die. He was taken, silenced, forgotten, and now, 42 years later, Mara Quinn, Resistance scout with more courage than rank had, brought him back. Smuggled through the sewers beneath Sector Delta, Reed's broken form barely registered the torchlight, flinching at shadows, shrinking from brightness, his body reacting before his mind could reason. But in the darkness of the forgotten shelter where she hid him, the spark returned. Slowly, he traced alien troop rotations in the dust with frightening precision, muttered coordinates in his sleep, and named biomech models no longer in use. Mara believed because she had seen it in his eyes. Something still fought inside him. But when she returned to her resistance cell hidden in the ruins of old Savannah, her triumph was met with disbelief. "You brought back a ghost," they muttered. Even Colonel Wes Quinn, Her adoptive father and former comrade of Lawson dismissed it all. That man isn't a weapon anymore, Mara. He's a relic. You don't build revolutions on corpses. And maybe they were right. Maybe he had survived only in the most technical sense. Maybe what she dragged from Cell 9 was just a shattered shell of what once was. Reed himself seemed to think so. One night, after hours spent in silence, he turned to her voice, barely above breath, and said with haunted finality, "I didn't survive. I just didn't die." But even as doubt rippled through her and the resistance weighed the cost of hope, Mara kept coming back to the same truth. They had buried Earth's greatest soldier alive and, now, for the first time in decades, the war might just have a second chance. Under the pallid morning light filtering through gray clouds choked with ash and drone exhaust, Mara Quinn stood with her squad on the windswept ridge overlooking the conversion farm, what the Varanth euphemistically called Sector 17 Biointegration Site. Below them, behind electrified fencing and biomech towers, rows of modular concrete blocks stretched across the scorched fields like infected wounds on the Earth's surface. It looked quiet, too quiet, which should have been the first sign. But the transmission had been clear, a desperate plea from inside. A coded distress signal that had pulsed through resistance relays 3 nights earlier. Civilians marked for permanent integration, non-combatants, children even, the kind of message you didn't ignore. So they mobilized. Not just her team, but a larger splinter cell operating beyond Colonel Wes Quinn's orders. Mara had argued fiercely for inclusion, and surprisingly, it wasn't Wes who convinced the team to bring Red. It was Red himself. Gaunt, still reeling from his time in Cell 9, every step for him was pain, but his mind, unmatched. He analyzed the patrol cycles, memorized drone rotations, and whispered like the wind when he spoke so low that only Mara, walking close enough to feel the bones under his skin, could hear him. "They'll expect an aerial approach. Come from ground tunnels instead. Trust me." She had. They all had, because something in the way he moved, the way he looked at the enemy installations even, with eyes dimmed by years of darkness. He wasn't just remembering, he was calculating. The assault began at 0300. Stealth teams cut fences and planted signal jammers. A dozen resistance fighters slipped in like shadows under black cloaks, spreading through the campus of the conversion farm, bypassing sensor tripwires and turrets. Mara led her team to holding block Delta, where a thermal scan had shown at least 50 living bodies crammed into a single concrete vault. Reed stayed with her. He refused to remain behind, even when Wes radioed in, furious. "You're risking everything for ghosts and guilt, Mara. He's not a soldier anymore." But she'd shut off the comm. Her gut said Reed wasn't done. They opened the vault. For a heartbeat, she believed they'd made it in time. Dozens of humans huddled inside, faces gaunt but alive. Hope bloomed. Then came the scream. Not human. The thermal body readings had been baked. A sudden impulse fried their radios. Biomech sentries sprang from concealed pits. Plasma rounds tore through the silence. Turrets unfolded from the ceilings. And before Mara could even react, half her team was gone, burned, shredded, dissolved, in pink mist. She screamed orders through the chaos. Fall back, but it was no use. The field had closed behind them, magnetic barriers sealing the exits. They were cattle in a slaughterhouse. Reed shoved her to the ground just before a beam sliced the air where her head had been. Blood poured from his side, but he didn't slow. "Run," he growled. Now, she hesitated. He was too slow, too broken to keep up, but the look in his eyes wasn't a request. It was command. So she ran. She barely made it out through a maintenance shaft that hadn't been on the blueprints. She dragged herself through mud and waste and the corpses of her friends, emerging into daylight hours later with lungs on fire and blood soaking her shirt, not all hers. Behind her, the farm went silent again. Reed was gone, captured, again, but this time, it was by choice. He was dragged limping, barely conscious into the core of the conversion farm, his wrists bound by biosteel cuffs that hummed with containment energy. The corridors hadn't changed. Same sterilized walls, same scent of acid and synthetic bleach. But one thing had changed. Waiting for him in the heart of the chamber was a nightmare. Wrapped in armor, the warden of Sector 17, a Varanth manipulator known not for brute force, but for something far more invasive. Karzel, the same being who had orchestrated his decades-long imprisonment. A creature of spindly limbs and a too-human face etched in shifting folds of semi-transparent skin. It wore an expression crafted to simulate empathy. Its most dangerous weapon wasn't the blade, but the mirror. "You came back," Karzel said, its voice a slow drizzle of silk. "I always knew you couldn't let her die. You still feel, after everything, you still care." It gestured toward a glowing wall of mind tether tech, dozens of coils designed to tap into the deepest emotional cores of their prisoners. "Shall we begin again?" Reed lifted his head slowly. There was no defiance left in his posture, no fire, but there was something deeper. He didn't resist, didn't flinch, just whispered, voice raw from disuse. "Then you still don't understand what pain really is." The connection surged to life. Mara, back at the Resistance hideout, refused to rest. Wes tried to ground her, shouted in her face, told her she'd gotten too many people killed already. Reed Lawson was a tragedy. Stop turning him into a savior. But she couldn't. Wouldn't. Something in her marrow told her Reed wasn't gone yet, that he let himself get captured, and that meant she owed him. Not just for her life, but for the spark of belief he'd lit in her, the kind that refused to die even in the dark. She stole a camel cruiser, rode solo back to the farm's outskirts, bypassed the biometric fence, using a corpse's severed arm and a false heat signature. Every moment was madness, every breath another second, borrowed from death. But she didn't stop. Through tunnels, power shafts, and maintenance grates, she clawed her way in, wounded, hunted, hallucinating from exhaustion. She reached the inner sanctum. She found Reed strapped to the mind tether, his face drenched in sweat, eyes rolling, teeth clenched. Karzel stood behind the glass, watching his readings like a maestro watching an orchestra's final note. That was when Mara detonated the emergency coolant line. Superheated steam blinded the sensors, glass shattered, sirens screamed. In the chaos, she pulled Reed free, tossed him over her shoulder despite his weight, and ran. Drone fire chased her through the corridors. One bolt seared her leg, another grazed her ribs. Reed stirred once, muttered something about southeast pipe junctions, and she followed it. 10 minutes later, covered in blood, grime, and half-conscious terror, they fell out of the ventilation shaft and collapsed under the rotting husk of an old rail system. She sat with him all night. His body trembled. His breath was shallow, but when he opened his eyes, for the first time she didn't see death there. She saw resolve. She whispered, "You came back for me." He shook his head slowly. "I came back for the war." And in that moment, Mara knew he wasn't just some relic from a forgotten campaign. He wasn't a broken man clinging to memories. He was still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, he was the only one who could teach the rest of them how. The air in the underground chamber pulsed with low, almost imperceptible vibrations, the kind that made teeth ache and silence feel wrong. Reed stood at the center of the dimly lit war room, his hands behind his back, his gaunt frame outlined by the flickering holograms of Varanth technology. Around him, half a dozen resistance leaders watched with skepticism, distrust, and in some cases open contempt. "You're telling us they've been broadcasting a signal into our minds," Colonel Wes Quinn snapped, barely restraining the tension in his voice. "And we just missed it." Reed didn't flinch. "It's not meant to be obvious. That's the point. They use a planetary dampening field, low-frequency neuromodulation, It suppresses organized defiance by disrupting cooperative cognitive patterns, makes people tired, numb, afraid to act. He pointed to a shifting waveform projected from a scavenged Varanth processor. That's why the resistance never reforms. Why cells can't stay united for long. The very planet is humming with fear engineered, broadcasted, maintained. Mara sat at the edge of the table, watching both men with the wary gaze of someone who loved them both and trusted neither fully anymore. Reed stepped forward, the steel in his voice rising. I think I can find the emitter. But we'll need to reach a Varanth hive server. The closest is beneath what used to be the Pentagon. The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. Suicide mission didn't even begin to cover it. The Pentagon ruins were in the middle of the eastern dead zone, surrounded by biomines, drone nests, and a permanent orbit of scout beacons. That's death, muttered Ortega, a veteran who'd survived the Boston collapse. Even if we could get past the perimeter, the hive server's buried in Varanth Black Ice security. You're asking us to trust a man who surrendered. Another voice chimed in Redis, once a commander, now a broken-eyed cynic. Or worse, maybe he never left their side. Ever think of that? That they let him go? The accusation hung like smoke. Mara's jaw clenched. Wes stayed silent, eyes fixed on the floor. Reed didn't answer the attack. He just looked tired and ancient. He'd worn his own silence for so long it had become armor, but now, under the weight of potential action, even that cracked. I never stopped fighting, he said softly, voice barely more than gravel. I just lost everything else. No one replied. The meeting dissolved in grumbles and side glances, and the plan was shelved for now. Back in the bunker's lower levels, the tension turned to whispers. Some feared Reed's presence was a liability. Others said he had already saved Mara once and earned his place. The resistance was always fractured, but now it began to bleed from within, and somewhere in that fraying trust, the mole moved. Cara Delan had been Mara's closest friend since the wasteland ops in Sector 6. She had shared food, blood, and grief with Mara, laughed in the silence of old ruins, held her when word came about her biological mother's execution. But she had also been broken during her own capture a year earlier, reconditioned by Varanth handlers. Her memories fractured and rewoven around a simple directive: observe and betray. And she did it well. When the ambush came, it was surgical. The hideout's perimeter sensors went offline for just 90 seconds, long enough for a Varanth strike team to burst through the upper level. Plasma rifles cutting through bunk walls and flesh alike. Wes sounded the alarm himself, grabbing an old railgun he could barely lift. Go, he barked, shoving Mara toward the exit shaft. Get him out. He's the only chance we've got. But she didn't move fast enough. A biomech round slammed into Wes's chest. He fell, bleeding out across broken tile and dust. Reed didn't leave him. Even as Mara pulled at his arm, Reed dropped to his knees beside the man who had once been his commanding officer. Once called him a liability, once spit his name like it was poison. You never stopped fighting, did you? Wes whispered, blood pooling under his jaw, his eyes starting to glass. I'm sorry I ever doubted you. And then the light left him. Reed didn't scream. He didn't collapse. But something inside him, buried for decades beneath layers of survival and numbness, cracked. His hand shook, but not from fear, not even from rage, from grief, the kind that stole the breath and made it hard to speak. He turned to Mara, voice raw. We finish this. No more hiding. No more waiting. We find that server, we kill the signal, and we give Earth its mind back. And this time, Mara didn't hesitate. She just nodded, took his hand, and together they slipped into the sewers as the bunker burned behind them. Above, Karzul watched the live feed from a stolen resistance drone, lips curled in something resembling amusement. Let them run, he said. They still believe in something. That's always the best part to break. But deep in the tunnels, As Reed and Mara vanished into the black, neither of them felt broken, just unfinished. The wind tore through the gutted skeleton of what was once the Pentagon. Now twisted steel and alien biomass fused into a grotesque monument of conquest. A Varanth fortress buried deep under the ruinous remains of Earth's old command center. Lightning slashed through a storm-choked sky as Mara, Red, and the last fragments of the resistance descended into the depths. A 6-person squad against an army of biomech sentries and kill drone swarms, all guided by the hive mind, rooted in the ancient corridors of global power. Their boots pounded against flooded sub-levels, the walls humming with Varanth frequency fields that made thoughts foggy. Hearts heavy, but they pushed forward, fueled by rage, memory, and the last desperate ember of rebellion. Blood slicked. The ground where Ortega fell, cut down by a dual plasma bolt to the chest. De La Rosa followed, her scream fading into static as drones swarmed the flank. Mara pressed forward, jaw clenched, hands blistered, eyes blazing. Reed limped beside her, barely breathing, but his mind was on fire, replaying the map of this place, from 40 years ago. The moment he'd last seen this hall, this corridor, this chamber where Earth gave its last breath, and the Varanth installed their dominion. The signal field thrummed around them, pressing down like gravity on the soul, designed to deaden human thought, fragment resistance, and drain the will to fight. But Reed wasn't here to deactivate it. They reached the core chamber, an alien cathedral of wires and organometal tendrils pulsing with violet energy. At its heart was the hive server, a towering column of light and frequency, surrounded by a suspended lattice of Varanth memory cores. Reed staggered forward, blood trailing from his mouth, his fingers dancing across ancient input nodes and stolen access scripts. "I can reverse the field," he said hoarsely, eyes flicking open with renewed fire. "We've always tried to turn it off. But what if we flip it?" Before Mara could question him, the chamber rippled and Karzel emerged. From the shadows, tall and still, the nightmare made flesh. "You never could break our control," the warden sneered, eyes gleaming with artificial empathy. "You're not freedom. You're residue. Echoes of a failed species." And with that, he activated the overload, a last failsafe, a full neural purge designed to melt the minds of any human within range, frying synapses with pure pain. Reed screamed not from agony, but from clarity. He slammed his palm onto the final control panel, overriding the purge, rewriting the algorithm not to deactivate, but to amplify. Across the planet, in slums and prisons, in mines and factories, in labor camps and decaying cities, something shifted. In prisons, in mines and factories, in labor camps and decaying cities, something shifted. The air felt lighter. The noise in people's heads went silent. A weight that no one remembered carrying suddenly vanished. And in that emptiness, something ancient surged up. A mechanic dropped his tools and raised his fist. A mother tore the control chip from her daughter's neck. A soldier in Varanth armor turned his gun on his alien handler. Screams of defiance rose across continents. A planet exhaled. Inside the core, Karzel lunged, but Reed met him mid-strike, bone against armor, soul against void. The battle was short, brutal, final. In the end, it wasn't strength that ended the warden, it was will. Reed's final words, as he drove the spike through Karzel's chest, were quiet, shaking. "You spent decades trying to make me forget who I was. All you did was remind me." The alien collapsed, body crackling and leaking shimmering fluid. Its last breath, a soundless rattle. Reed dropped to his knees, coughing blood, vision dimming. Mara caught him as he fell, clutching him against her chest, as alarms screamed, and the chamber began to collapse. "We did it," she whispered, tears streaking her ash-stained face. "You did it." Reed's voice was barely audible as he smiled through the pain. "No, we did." And as she hoisted him onto her shoulders, fire blazing behind them, and the core melting into light. They emerged from the ruins into a world no longer asleep, because finally, at long last, Earth was awake. In the days that followed the reversal of the Varanth signal, the world changed with a ferocity and clarity no one could have predicted, as if the planet itself had been holding its breath for 4 decades and was finally exhaling, letting loose a scream of defiance that echoed from the scorched plains of Africa to the submerged towers of Shanghai, from the ruins of Washington, D.C., to the orbital prison rings, now blinking offline in Earth's lower atmosphere. Cities that had long forgotten the meaning of rebellion roared back to life, their people pouring into the streets, not as scattered survivors, but as a tidal wave of vengeance and reclamation. Biomech sentries, once feared as gods, were now dragged down by mobs wielding tools, fire, and raw rage. Varanth officers who had ruled from glass towers vanished or were executed in impromptu tribunals, and the networks, those fragile threads of communication between fractured cells, lit up with one repeated name, the same name that now echoed in every war camp, radio burst, and graffiti-scarred wall: Reed Lawson, the man who didn't break. The Iron Ghost, the one they buried alive. Footage of his teared, bruised, but unbent flashed across hacked billboards. His voice played over static-laced frequencies, reminding the world that endurance was a form of resistance, that pain was not the end, but the beginning of reclamation. Meanwhile, in what was once Savannah, Mara Quinn walked the scarred remnants of the old resistance base, now transformed into one of the many command centers of a new global alliance. Her eyes cold and quiet as she entered the interrogation chamber, where Cara Delon waited in chains. Cara, her face hollow, her body shaking, lifted her eyes and whispered, "I didn't know they'd kill him. I didn't know Wes would be." But Mara didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped forward and stared down at the woman who had once been her sister in arms, her confidant. "You knew what they were doing," Mara said, her voice like steel, wrapped in grief. "You knew, and you still let my father die?" Cara sobbed, begging for mercy, for a second chance, but Mara didn't offer judgment, only silence. She turned away, stepping out of the room, leaving Cara's fate in the hands of the newly formed Earth Council, a governing body built from the Resistance's remains, from old soldiers, thinkers, and survivors finally allowed to choose their future. Mara didn't need vengeance. She needed forward. He was hospitalized in a converted Resistance safehouse, his body shattered in more ways than even the most advanced medtech could fix. Plasma burns ran across his torso. His neural pathways had been strained to the point of collapse. The years of psychological torture, the overload at the Hive server, the final confrontation with Karzel, they had left marks that would never fade. But his eyes were clear, lucid, present. Every day Mara came to him, sometimes with flowers picked from the first regrown fields of reclaimed territory, sometimes with stories of how far the revolts had spread, how children were being named after her father, after him, how former collaborators now stood trial in open squares where thousands watched. Sometimes she brought him nothing but silence, sitting beside his bed while he stared at the ceiling, listening to the world rebuild itself. "They couldn't break you," she told him once, her hand resting over his bandaged one, voice thick with everything unspoken. "But you broke their world." Reed turned his head slightly, his lips twitching into the faintest, saddest smile, and in that moment, Mara knew he would never walk again, never fight again, not with fists, not with commands, but he had already given them everything they needed. His survival had not been passive. It had been the spark that lit the storm. He had been the voice that whispered resist in the dark, and now that voice had become thunder across a liberated Earth. Outside the hospital, Resistance banners flew beside new flags. People cleared wreckage not because they had to, but because now they could. Children played without looking over their shoulders. And somewhere beyond the clouds, The last Varanth ships broke orbit, retreating from a world they could no longer control, a species they could no longer manipulate, and a name they could no longer silence. The day the signal fell became known as the day they couldn't own us, a living reminder that even in the face of calculated subjugation, one soul that refused to bend could unmake an empire. Reed Lawson became legend not for how many he saved or how many he killed, but because, for over 40 years, he chose to remember who he was. And through him, Earth remembered too. Months had passed since the neural dampening field was shattered. Since the last of the Varanth motherships fled Earth's orbit like wounded gods, retreating from a world that had remembered how to roar. The skies no longer echoed with the thunder of biomech patrols. The cities no longer bore the oppressive hum of invisible control. And humanity, bruised but unbroken, stepped tentatively into the long-forgotten practice of rebuilding. Across the planet, ruins were cleared, not just for survival, but for remembrance murals painted over bombed-out walls, gardens blooming in the craters left by orbital strikes, old resistance safe houses turned into schools, forums, places of memory and education. In one such school, tucked in what was once a ruined borough of Chicago, and now called New Halcyon, a young boy raised his hand in a history class taught beneath a solar-paneled ceiling, his voice trembling but full of curiosity. Why did the aliens lose? The teacher paused, scanning the room, before gesturing to the holographic display mounted against the far wall. With a flick of her fingers, the screen flared to life, revealing a grainy, yet iconic image. Reed Lawson, gaunt, scarred, standing at the edge of the crater where the Hive server had once pulsed with planetary control, his eyes sunken yet fiercely alert, body broken but will untouched. As the image stabilized, a quiet voiceover began an archival clip from the first Unified Resistance broadcast, because there was one man they couldn't break, and we remembered him. The room fell silent. The boy leaned forward. He had heard stories. Of course, everyone had, but this was different. This was truth, recorded and preserved. His classmates looked at the image not as myth, but as origin. Elsewhere, far from the classrooms and the speeches and the newly rebuilt towers, Mara Quinn walked slowly down a shaded path, lined with young trees and benches carved from scavenged war wreckage. She wore no uniform now, no weapons, only a simple jacket and boots, still dusty from travel. Ahead stood a quiet rehabilitation facility, on the edge of what had once been a front line, now peaceful, almost sacred. The guards didn't stop her, they knew who she was. They always knew. Inside, the hallway smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant, but it wasn't sterile. It felt lived in, like hope had managed to settle between the floorboards. At the far end, through an open door, sat Reed Lawson in a wheelchair, his back to her, staring through a wide glass window at the open sky beyond, where clouds drifted lazily, without the watchful glint of orbital drones. His hair had grown out in tufts of silver and black, his frame still gaunt, but his shoulders straighter than they had been in months. Mara stepped in quietly, her boots barely making a sound on the tile. She didn't announce herself, she didn't have to. He knew it was her. He always did. Without turning, he said softly, "It's strange. I forgot how blue the sky could be." She moved beside him, kneeling gently at his side, her hand brushing against his. "It's still here," she said, "just like you." His eyes, still sharp, despite the weight of years, shifted to meet hers. "Some days, I feel like I'm still down there," he murmured. "In the dark, in that cell, waiting." She shook, her head, her voice firm but full of warmth. "You're not anymore. They used to call you the ghost. A name whispered in fear, in stories, in half-remembered dreams. But we see you now, all of us." His breath caught slightly, a flicker of emotion passing through his features like the shadow of a bird across glass. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. Outside, The skies began to shift with color as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the clouds in gold and crimson. People gathered in cities and towns across the globe, in deserts and forests and mountaintops, in what remained of old nations and what had yet to be named. Tonight was Earth's first true Independence Day in 43 years, not a political declaration, but a spiritual one, a moment to honor not just freedom from alien rule, but the return of agency, of memory, of humanity's right to define its future. Fireworks screamed into the sky, cobbled together from old military stocks and civilian engineering. They burst into glorious arcs of light above rebuilt skylines and open fields. From his window, Reed watched the explosions with a kind of reverent silence, the colors reflecting in his eyes as children laughed somewhere in the distance and music drifted up from the valley below. Beside him, Mara didn't speak, she just sat with him, shoulder to shoulder, as the sky bloomed in defiance and celebration. The war had taken everything, friends, years, innocence, but it had not taken him, and that, more than any weapon or strategy, had turned the tide. Because in the end, all it took was one man who refused to vanish. One soul too stubborn to be rewritten, one ghost who became a beacon. The fire lit by Reed Lawson burned not in the sky, but in the people who now stood upright, unafraid. He had no medals, no statues. He didn't need them, because now finally, fully, irrevocably Earth remembered